The military base, hidden deep within the Appalachian woods, looked as though nature itself was trying to erase it from existence. Built back in the 1940s, it started as a training camp and an ammunition depot, but after World War II, its glory days were over. Slowly, the military abandoned it, leaving fences to rust, asphalt to crack, and buildings to become nests for mold and moss. Tree roots, almost alive, pushed up the fences, and birds turned the empty barracks into their concert halls. By the 2020s, the base got a second chance. The National Guard decided to bring it back to life, partially at least. A handful of buildings were restored, while most of the grounds were left to grow wild. And in August, a group of us soldiers was sent there for routine training. My name's Max. I'm 25, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure why I got into this in the first place. People say soldiers need motivation, honor, duty, country. For me, it was simpler. I ran away from my hometown because staying there felt like surrendering to boredom and hopelessness. Crappy supermarket job, endless nights of drinking after shifts, and the same aimless crowd around me. The army seemed like the best way out. It wasn't exactly a dream, but at least something was happening here. At first, it felt like we'd hit the jackpot. The base, though isolated in the middle of nowhere, was surprisingly comfortable. Quiet, spacious barracks with new renovations. They brought in new furniture, still smelling of varnish, and a few generators so we wouldn't sit in the dark. It seemed like the perfect spot for survival and patrol training. Our commander was immediately excited to take full advantage of the base's seclusion. The training was tough but fair, and night shifts were a great way to adjust to the wilderness. No one complained. Well, almost no one. We got one chance to visit a nearby town for supplies and a bit of a break. The town was tiny, almost like a toy village. A few streets, a couple of bars, a gas station, and a dusty little store. It was quiet and uneventful. But the locals were clearly curious about us. At first, they just stared from under their brows, but then they started asking strange questions. "Everything okay out there? You notice anything unusual?" the bar owner asked, wiping a glass with a rag that looked older than him. "That place, you know, it's strange," added a woman in the grocery store, like she was afraid to say too much. Of course, the soldiers just laughed it off, brushing their words aside as small-town superstitions. Even the commander, when he heard about the conversations, dismissed them as attempts to scare us and nothing more. But stuff like that always got to me. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but stories about vanished towns or ancient hexes always gave me a thrill. So when I ran into an old man at the bar who clearly knew something interesting, I couldn't resist. I bought him a couple of drinks and started asking questions. The old man, wiry but solid and with snow-white hair, accepted the drinks with a smirk. He took his time before speaking. "You know what the locals call the land your base sits on, the Cursed Valley. It goes way back, kid. Legend says settlers lived there in the 1600s. Not many of them. And they were surrounded by forest. Like being in a trap. Raids, starvation, disease. But they didn't give up. They started performing strange rituals for protection, they said. Or maybe something more. Who can say now?" He took a sip, his voice growing quieter as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. "Then things went bad. One day, some traders showed up to check on them. Instead of settlers, they found empty houses, no bodies, no tracks, just a suffocating silence. All that was left was an old church carved with images of wolves and a graveyard where the crosses seemed to stare at you. They say the elders placed a curse before they disappeared. to keep the land theirs forever. I listened intently, though part of me was already gearing up to laugh. "What's with the wolves, then?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. The old man grinned, showing yellow teeth. "The wolves. They've always been there on the edge of the woods. People around here say they've seen them, huge shadows, heard their howls at night. Maybe it's the spirits of those settlers. Maybe it's something worse." I smiled, pretending to be impressed. Just spooky campfire tales, nothing more. But still, the story stuck with me. The first month passed surprisingly uneventfully. We patrolled the grounds, went through standard training drills, and spent our evenings in the barracks, joking and swapping stories. Everything felt routine, even dull at times. The forest around us, of course, occasionally came alive with strange noises, branches snapping, rustling, or heavy thuds, as if something large was moving through the underbrush. But we always chalked it up to animals or the wind playing tricks. A few of the guys, though, mentioned that something about the base felt off. The atmosphere seemed heavy, oppressive. "It's just nerves," someone joked, "or boredom. We're sitting here like canned sardines." But jokes aside, the feeling of being watched occasionally got to even me. In those moments, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder to make sure no one or nothing was there. One day at lunch, something happened that made us all pause. Jared, one of the guys, noticed deep scratches on the door frame in the mess hall. He ran his fingers over them, frowning. "Hey, who's been clawing at this?" he asked. We all gathered to take a look. The marks were strange, long, deep, as if something with claws had raked across the wood with force. No one could explain how they'd gotten there. At first, we thought it might have been caused by tools or weapons, but the gouges looked like they'd been made by an animal, and not a small one. From that day on, tension started to build. Some of the guys began complaining about strange dreams. They spoke of a forest bathed in silver moonlight. A few said they felt like they were being watched in these dreams, though they could never turn to see who or what it was. One guy, a rookie named Riley, nervously laughed as he described seeing a figure standing among the trees. It almost blended with the shadows, he said, but it was watching him. "Too many horror movies before bed," an older veteran muttered, though even he looked uneasy. Then the wolves began to appear. The sentries on the perimeter spotted them first. The wolves didn't attack or come close. They just stood at the edge of the forest, almost melting into the shadows, staring at us. Their eyes gleamed amber in the dark, and there was something deeply unsettling about their gaze. They only came at night and disappeared with the first light of dawn. No one could figure out why they were there or why their behavior was so odd. It felt like the forest itself was watching us. With each passing day, the sense of an unseen presence grew stronger, even in broad daylight. We cracked jokes to ease the tension, but the laughter was strained, and conversations often died mid-sentence when another strange sound echoed from the woods. Then came the night when Michael Rogers took his shift. His post was on the southern perimeter of the base, right by the edge of the forest. The night started off like any other, quiet, warm, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. Michael leaned against the wall, lazily checking his watch. Everything was as it always was, until it wasn't. The forest ahead of him suddenly went still. The usual hum of nocturnal insects vanished. The hoots of owls ceased, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The silence was so thick it pressed against his ears. By midnight, things got stranger. A chill ran down Michael's spine, though the night remained warm. Then he heard it. A long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees. It wasn't like a normal wolf's cry. It was deeper, tinged with something almost human, like a scream of agony. The sound froze him in place. After a moment, he grabbed his flashlight and decided to investigate. Michael walked along the fence, shining his light into the woods. The beam illuminated tree trunks, bushes, and patches of empty ground, nothing unusual. Just as he was about to turn back, something on the ground caught his eye. Tracks. Massive paw prints with deep gouges, as if the creature had been dragging claws behind it. But what made his blood run cold was the set of barefoot human prints beside them, leading into the forest. He crouched to get a closer look at the tracks when a loud snap of breaking branches made him whip his head around. In the darkness, between the trees, he saw a shadow flicker. Michael shot to his feet and shouted. A low growl answered him. It was loud, guttural, and so deep that he felt it vibrate in his chest. This wasn't the sound of any ordinary animal. Michael bolted back toward his post. His flashlight slipped from his hand, but he didn't stop to pick it up. Behind him, he heard heavy footsteps as though something was chasing him. When he reached the door, he slammed it shut and locked it with trembling hands. But the sounds didn't stop. Something was scratching at the metal, slow and deliberate. It almost felt like whatever it was testing the door's strength. Michael stood there, clutching his rifle, eyes glued to the door, until the noises finally faded. The next morning, everyone was talking about the deep scratches that had appeared on the door where Michael had been stationed. The marks were wide and deep, as though made by something with enormous claws. He recounted what had happened, but most of the guys just laughed it off. They claimed he'd made the marks himself with a knife to scare the rest of us. But Michael didn't laugh, and neither did I. The commander dismissed Michael's report with skepticism. He claimed it was just exhaustion, stress, or an attention-seeking stunt. Night shifts, the forest, and those ridiculous local ghost stories? It's no wonder someone's imagination got the better of them, he said, with a dismissive wave. But things quickly spiraled beyond the realm of coincidence. The next morning, we were jolted awake by a commotion on the base. One of the soldiers was the first to notice deep gashes on the door of the barracks. These weren't ordinary scratches. They were long, deep grooves, as if made by the claws of a massive beast. The metal had been scored so deeply that it was impossible to chalk it up to carelessness or a prank. The commander inspected the damage, frowning, but all he said was, "Someone thinks this is funny. I'll find out who, and they'll be pulling extra patrols." We exchanged uneasy glances, but stayed silent. Later that day, during a routine perimeter check, a couple of soldiers found more tracks in the woods. At first, they were massive paw prints deeply pressed into the damp earth. But a few yards further, the tracks changed. Human footprints, bare and unmistakable, as if someone had walked straight out of their animal form. The discovery left those who saw it in stunned silence. No one reported it to the commander, but from that point on, everyone kept their weapons a little closer. That night, another soldier, Carlos, known for his unshakable demeanor and sound sleep, was startled awake by a howl. It was low and mournful, filling the night with a primal resonance that made his heart race. He jumped out of bed and went to the window where he caught a glimpse of something. A massive shadow moved at the edge of the forest. It was too large to be a wolf or a bear, but in the dim light he couldn't make out details. Grabbing his weapon, Carlos ran outside, but by the time he got there, the figure was gone. All that remained was a torn section of the perimeter fence swaying in the breeze. Carlos shared his experience the next day, but most of the group dismissed it with shrugs or half-hearted jokes. Even so, the tension among us was palpable. The most unsettling report came from Jake, another soldier who claimed he'd seen something near the old cemetery beyond the base. The cemetery was a long-forgotten place. A few crooked crosses, their paint chipped and moss-covered, and the remains of structures left behind by settlers. Jake said his patrol had taken him close to the area, and while scanning the perimeter, he noticed a tall figure standing among the gravestones. According to him, the figure looked human but had elongated limbs and an unnatural posture. It had eyes like burning coals and claws, Jake said, his face pale. I know how it sounds, but that wasn't a person. The commander, tired of the rumors and the rising fear, organized a small group of 3 soldiers, including me, to investigate. Armed with rifles, flashlights, and strict orders to report anything unusual, we headed out toward the cemetery. None of us wanted to go, but after everything that had happened, ignorance felt even more dangerous. By the time the sun had fully set, we reached the cemetery. The forest felt different at night, alive, the trees leaning over the path as though watching us. The air was thick with dampness and the rotting scent of old leaves. We moved in silence, ears straining for any sound. The cemetery, bathed in cold moonlight, looked more menacing than Jake had described. The ground was uneven, overgrown with moss and roots, as if the land itself was trying to reclaim its forgotten dead. Crooked crosses cast long, twisted shadows. At first, all was quiet. We stuck close together, scanning the area carefully. Then I saw him, a man standing among the gravestones. He seemed to be waiting, his head bowed. When I shone my flashlight on him, he slowly turned to face us. His eyes reflected the light, glowing a sickly yellow, inhuman and predatory. "Hey, who are you?" one of us shouted. There was no response. The man began to move, but not like a person. His motions were jerky, almost broken, as though his body was fighting against itself. We watched in horrified silence as the sound of bones cracking filled the air. His arms lengthened, his fingers growing into claws. Fur sprouted from his skin, and his face elongated into a grotesque snout. In mere moments, the figure before us was no longer human. It was a creature, a beast that seemed part wolf, part man. "Shoot!" someone yelled, and we opened fire. The creature roared and lunged at us. The gunfire echoed through the cemetery as bullets struck their target, but they seemed to do little more than enrage it. Finally, one of our shots caught its shoulder. The beast let out a piercing guttural howl, its voice reverberating through the graveyard. Bleeding, it retreated into the woods, leaving a trail of dark blood behind. We stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. Our flashlights revealed a path of blood leading deeper into the forest. Following it, we came to an old colonial church. It looked like it would collapse with the slightest touch, its doors ajar and the interior shrouded in silence. Inside, the church was eerie. Strange symbols had been carved into the walls, their meanings lost to time. Near the altar, we found an ancient weathered journal. Its pages were stained and faded, but some of the text was legible. The journal detailed the settlers' efforts to protect themselves from starvation and raids through strange rituals. One entry described sacrifices that supposedly cursed the community. The curse, according to the author, was meant to protect the land by transforming its inhabitants into guardians, beings that were neither fully human nor fully animal. The final entry was scrawled hastily, the words frantic. "We have unlocked something far greater than we understand. They are now part of the forest, and the forest is part of them. After we returned to the base, the tension was palpable. We handed over the journal we'd found and recounted everything that had happened at the cemetery and inside the church. The commander listened carefully but made it clear he wasn't taking any of it seriously. In his report, he attributed it all to fatigue, stress, and what he called mass hysteria. We all knew it was a lie, but none of us dared to challenge him. Things on the base quickly went from bad to worse. On the first night after our mission, someone reported hearing strange sounds, growls or howls, right outside the barracks. Sentries patrolling the perimeter claimed they saw massive shadows lurking at the edge of the woods. Tracks, similar to the ones we'd found before, started appearing all over the base. Then came the attacks. The first to disappear were 2 rookies. They failed to return from a routine night patrol, even though their route stayed close to the base. At dawn, we found their weapons scattered on the ground and signs of a struggle leading into the forest. Their bodies were never recovered. The commander tried to maintain composure, but it was clear even he was beginning to unravel. A few nights later, another sentry was attacked at his post. He was found alive the next morning, but barely conscious. His body was covered in deep scratches, and his face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. He mumbled incoherently about eyes in the dark and teeth watching from the shadows. They sent him to the hospital, and we were ordered to double patrols. But doubling the patrols didn't help. The strange noises grew louder, especially at night. Sometimes it was a howl, sometimes a guttural growl, as though something was struggling to breathe through its anger. None of us slept well anymore. The forest seemed alive, as though it were breathing. Even the commander eventually admitted that the situation had spiraled out of control. The decision to shut down the base came suddenly. We were informed that the site would be decommissioned and the personnel evacuated. No official explanation was given, but we all knew the brass wanted nothing to do with whatever was happening. Before we left, we were ordered to keep everything that had happened classified. The events at the base were sealed behind layers of red tape and secrecy. None of us knew what would happen to the place after we left. Once evacuated, the base was left to decay. The fences rusted, the buildings crumbled under the weight of time and the encroaching forest. But the stories didn't disappear. Locals still spoke of strange sounds emanating from the woods. Those brave or foolish enough to approach claimed they saw a massive wolf-like shadow prowling under the moonlight, as if guarding something or someone. The tales of the base became an urban legend. Whispers of the cursed valley spread, with rumors that the forest remained under the protection of its ancient curse. The werewolves, born of the settlers' rituals, were said to have become its eternal guardians. No one dared to confirm these stories, but everyone knew one thing. It was best to stay far away from the forest in the cursed valley. Story 2. My name is Tom Harper. I'm an archaeologist from New York, specializing in ancient South American cultures. This work has never been just a job for me. It's more of an obsession. When you immerse yourself in the mysteries of the past, inhaling the scent of earth untouched by modern hands, you begin to understand what it means to truly live. My team is small but reliable, built on years of trust. Liz, my assistant, is the backbone of our operations. She handles every detail with precision and always finds a way to make me smile, even on the darkest days. Dan, our geologist, brings invaluable expertise to our work. Then there's Alejandro, our local guide, whose knowledge of the jungle is nothing short of astonishing. This time, the goal of our expedition was particularly intriguing. We were searching for the remains of a Jesuit mission settlement founded in the 18th century. The missionaries had come with noble intentions, bringing Christianity to these lands. But their story ends abruptly. One day, their trace simply vanished. No bodies, no records, just rumors and myths passed down through generations. Our journey began with a long trip upriver. The boat was old, its engine sputtering as though it might give out at any moment, but we pressed on. After 2 days, we reached a remote village. There, among the crumbling huts and wary glances of the locals, we met the village elder. His name was Kaio, and he looked at us as though he knew something we didn't. "Do not go further," he said when we explained the purpose of our expedition. His voice was raspy, like someone who had spent decades whispering to spirits. "That land is Kapak Tukuma." He spoke of an ancient curse, of hunter spirits protecting the land from outsiders. According to him, no one who dared to cross into the forbidden territory ever returned. To us, it sounded like just another local legend, the kind that every culture has in abundance. Liz, Dan, and I exchanged glances and silently agreed. It was merely an attempt to scare off strangers. Kaio only shook his head as he watched us pack our gear. There was something strange in his eyes, not anger or fear, but a quiet resignation. It was as if he had seen this all before. We reached the ruins of the mission settlement around midday. The oppressive heat and humidity of the jungle clung to us like a second skin, and the cacophony of rustling leaves, snapping branches, and distant bird cries made it feel like the jungle itself was alive, watching. The ruins emerged suddenly, half-collapsed structures barely visible beneath layers of thick vegetation, as if the jungle were deliberately hiding them from prying eyes. The stone walls were cracked and crumbling, and where roofs remained, they sagged under the weight of vines and roots that had forced their way through over decades. Liz was the first to point out that the scene felt eerily abandoned, as if the people had fled in a hurry. Scattered across the floor of one hut were shards of ceramic vessels, their intricate designs still faintly visible. Tools were left to gather dust on tables, and in one corner a wooden cross lay overturned. Dan studied the walls, his trained eye tracing the signs of age and weathering when he suddenly called out to us. "There's something here," he said, gesturing to a cluttered corner buried under debris. We began clearing it away, moving aside fragments of a collapsed wooden shelf and faded sheets of paper. Beneath it all, we uncovered a leather-bound journal. The cover was warped from moisture, but several pages inside had survived. The ink had faded, but the entries were still legible. They belonged to a priest, written in neat, precise handwriting. One passage immediately caught our attention. They called her the Mother of the Jungle. Her temple was hidden deep within the forest, and her presence could be felt everywhere. We tried to destroy this pagan place, but each step forward brought new misfortunes. I fear we have awakened something that should have been left undisturbed. Liz read the words aloud, her voice faltering slightly. Dan shook his head silently, and Alejandro, who had been listening in, turned away, his face shadowed with unease. Despite the growing tension, we continued our exploration of the ruins, pushing aside the creeping uneasiness. As we moved through the site, Liz noticed strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding the settlement. The markings were crude but fresh, as if someone had etched them only recently. The shapes resembled human faces, distorted and grotesque, their exaggerated features unsettling enough to send chills up my spine. "It's some kind of warning," Liz said, glancing at Alejandro, who stood nearby with his fists clenched. He didn't reply, but the grim set of his jaw spoke volumes. When night fell, we set up camp near the ruins. The usual jungle lull of chirping insects and rustling leaves seemed muted, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed on us like a weight. We sat around the fire, speaking little, each lost in our thoughts. Then the silence broke, a faint rhythm at first, then louder and more deliberate. Drums. The sound was primal, ominous, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The first noise came from the direction of our supplies. Liz, sitting closest, stiffened at the movement. "Who's there?" she called, her voice unsteady. I jumped to my feet, gripping my flashlight. The beam of light caught a figure, a tall, swift shadow, too agile to be human, yet disturbingly close in form. It paused for a moment, then melted back into the jungle. I barely caught a glimpse before it was gone. "Who's out there?" Dan shouted, raising his machete. There was no reply, only the sound of trees creaking and something that might have been laughter, low, guttural, and disturbingly wrong. When we reached the supply area, it was clear we'd been raided. Bags were slashed open, food scattered across the ground. The tracks left behind were indistinct, as though deliberately erased. Alejandro surveyed the scene, his face grim. "This is a warning," he said at last. "Spirits are locals. Their way of telling us to leave." I knew he wasn't joking. His usually stoic face betrayed a flicker of something, not fear exactly, but an ominous certainty. He wanted to leave, and it was written all over him. "We can't just pack up and go," I said, forcing my voice to remain firm. "We're close to the end. I'll double your pay if you stay." Alejandro said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the jungle where the intruders had vanished. Finally, he let out a heavy breath and nodded. The next day, as we prepared to move further into the jungle, we were stopped by a group of indigenous people. They appeared out of nowhere, moving so silently it was as if the jungle had birthed them. Their faces were painted in red and black patterns, and they carried long spears. One of them stepped forward and began speaking in a firm, measured tone. Alejandro translated almost immediately. "You have desecrated this land," he said. "You have awakened its guardians. Kapak Tukuma is already here." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Though I didn't fully understand their meaning, the tension on Liz and Dan's faces told me they felt the same creeping dread. "Who are these guardians?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Alejandro's translation was brief but chilling. "They are the spirits of hunters. They come to protect the goddess." One of the tribesmen stepped closer, fixing me with a gaze full of disdain and something deeper, almost predatory. "The goddess is hungry," he said slowly, his words carrying the weight of a verdict. "She demands sacrifice." Liz swallowed hard. Dan tightened his grip on his machete, visibly preparing for the worst. As for me, I couldn't decide who the real threat was, the people in front of us or whatever was lurking behind them in the shadows of the jungle. After a tense pause, the group retreated into the trees, disappearing as suddenly as they had arrived. By evening, we found the entrance to the temple, just as the shadows stretched long and dark across the jungle floor, as if the forest itself were trying to stop us from taking another step. Thick vines nearly obscured the stone archway, but upon closer inspection, it was clear this structure was ancient. The carvings on the stone had been eroded by time, but enough remained to evoke an undeniable sense of unease. Figures twisted in pain or reverence adorned the walls, their faces obscured or grotesque, hinting at rituals long forgotten. Alejandro stepped back the moment he saw it. "This is it," he whispered, almost inaudibly. "The temple." We ventured inside. The air was thick and stagnant, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic. The beams of our flashlights illuminated the walls, revealing more carved figures. Human shapes, but grotesquely distorted. Heads detached from bodies, arms outstretched unnaturally, all depicted in strange and violent poses. It was clear these carvings were not meant to comfort. They spoke of rituals steeped in fear and blood. In the center of the chamber stood a massive altar, roughly hewn from stone. Despite its age, dark stains marred its surface. Liz ran her fingers over one of the spots, her face twisting in disgust. This is blood," she said softly, "and it looks fresh." We exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke, but the unasked question hung in the air. If the blood was fresh, had someone been here recently? Or worse, were they still here? We returned to camp, setting up extra lights in a desperate attempt to ward off the oppressive darkness. But the flames offered little comfort. The images from the temple lingered in our minds, a silent weight none of us could shake. The next morning, we noticed Dan was missing. His bed was empty, his flashlight lying abandoned on the ground. At first, we assumed he had wandered off for some reason, but as the hours passed, unease turned to dread. We began searching for him, calling his name, but the jungle answered only with echoes and the rustle of unseen movements. When we found him, my stomach churned. Dan's body lay twisted in the tall grass not far from camp. His limbs were contorted, frozen in a posture of resistance. But the most horrifying detail was his head, or rather, the absence of it. His neck ended in a clean, bloody stump, as if his head had been severed with precision. Liz screamed. Alejandro crossed himself, muttering prayers in Spanish. I couldn't move, paralyzed by a terror so primal it felt like my own body had betrayed me. Panic overtook us, a tidal wave that shattered the last fragments of rational thought. The temple, the journal, even Dan's mangled body, none of it mattered anymore. Survival was all we could think about. Alejandro urged us to move quickly, his usually stoic demeanor now cracking under the weight of the situation. We grabbed only the essentials and set off toward the river where our boats awaited. But when we reached the shore, hope turned to despair. One of the boats had been completely destroyed, splintered into useless fragments. The other, though intact, had been sabotaged. Its hull punctured, its oars missing. The jungle around us was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. "We can't stay here," Alejandro said, his voice grim as he examined the damage. "We'll have to find another way." He led us deeper into the jungle, promising to guide us to another part of the river. But as we pressed on, the sensation of being watched became unbearable. Leaves rustled where there was no wind. Distant cracks of branches grew closer, their origins hidden. We saw nothing, but the oppressive presence was undeniable. Alejandro was at the front of our group when a sharp whistle cut through the air, a sound so sudden and precise it seemed to slice through the jungle itself. He let out a strangled cry and fell. When we reached him, the sight froze me in place. An arrow, crudely fashioned but deadly, protruded from his chest. Blood quickly soaked his shirt as his breath came in shallow gasps. "They're here," he whispered, clutching my arm weakly. His grip loosened, and he went still. Liz sobbed openly while I stood motionless, trying to process what had just happened. Then I saw them. Through the dense foliage, shadowy figures emerged. Tall, grotesque shapes adorned with masks that distorted already unnatural features. Their presence was brief, a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough. They vanished back into the jungle as silently as they had come. We ran. Branches clawed at us, roots snagged our feet, but we didn't stop. The jungle grew denser with each step, as if it were alive, conspiring to trap us. Liz clung to my hand, tears streaming down her face, her breath ragged with panic. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of movement behind us felt like the approach of death itself. We didn't know where we were going. The jungle had swallowed all familiar landmarks, turning into an endless maze of green shadows. And still, we ran. Pushing through the dense foliage, I suddenly realized I was staring at the same vine-covered archway. Somehow, impossibly, we were back at the temple. "This can't be," Liz whispered, her wide eyes locking with mine. Her voice trembled, and a cold wave of dread swept through me. It was as if the jungle itself had been toying with us, leading us back to where everything had begun, or perhaps where it was meant to end. Liz knelt, frantically scanning the ground, searching for any sign that could explain how we had circled back. Then she spotted it. Nestled among the roots and debris lay a small figurine carved from bone. She picked it up, examining it under the beam of her flashlight. It was a grotesque effigy of an old woman, her face twisted and deformed, her features so detailed they seemed to leer back at us. "It's her," Liz whispered, her voice barely audible. "The goddess." That was when I heard it. A faint rustling, then movement. Not the subtle ambient noises of the jungle, but deliberate footsteps. We turned, and they emerged from the shadows. Figures stepped out of the jungle, one by one, moving with a predator's unnatural grace. They resembled people, but something about them was profoundly wrong. Their limbs moved as though disjointed, their spines hunched unnaturally. The most horrifying part was their faces, or rather the lack of them. Wooden masks obscured their features, crudely carved and smeared with what looked like dried blood. Each mask was unique. One bore a crooked smile, another gaping, empty eye sockets, and yet another a frozen scream. We stumbled backward, our breaths quick and shallow as they closed in, tightening the circle. Liz gripped my hand so tightly I could feel her nails digging into my skin. "Tom, what do we do?" she whispered, her voice filled with desperate hope that I might have an answer. But I had none. Then the fog began to seep out of the temple, thick and white, curling around us like a living thing. Within moments, it consumed everything. Liz's grip slipped from my hand. The fog swallowed her, leaving me with only the sound of retreating footsteps. Then, a scream, raw and primal, filled with pain and terror, ripped through the air, freezing me in place. It was like walking through a wall of ice. I couldn't see or feel anything beyond the choking, oppressive cold. Her scream cut off abruptly, leaving a void of silence that pressed in from all sides. I was alone. The faceless figures loomed in the mist, their masks now seemingly alive, their hollow eyes watching me. I turned and ran into the temple, my fear driving me forward, logic abandoned. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the smell of blood, decay, and something foul I couldn't place. My flashlight danced erratically over the walls, illuminating carvings that seemed to twist and writhe in the flickering light. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the shadows or if the images were truly moving. The altar in the center was surrounded by piles of skulls, meticulously arranged into a grotesque monument. Beyond it stood a black stone throne, etched with symbols I couldn't understand. Sitting atop it was her, the old woman. Her body was grotesque, far larger than it should have been, as if bloated with some unnatural energy. She leaned on a gnarled staff, shaped like a serpent, tapping it rhythmically against the stone. The sound reverberated through my bones, shaking me to my core. Her face, just like the figurine, was a twisted mockery of humanity, her features distorted beyond recognition. But her eyes, they were black voids, infinite and consuming, filled with a malevolent power beyond comprehension. I froze as her cracked lips began to move, but no words came. Instead, the walls themselves began to whisper. "You have disturbed what is not yours. This place belongs to us. The jungle belongs to us. Leave or you will become part of it." The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that built into a deafening roar. The old woman raised her staff, and I felt the weight of her gaze, the oppressive force of her will. She was about to strike. Instinct took over. My hands fumbled for the small canister of lamp oil in my pack. I poured it over the throne, the altar, the walls, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Then I struck a match. The flames roared to life, climbing the stone and licking at the carvings. The old woman let out a piercing scream, guttural and otherworldly, as the fire consumed the chamber. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran, the heat of the blaze chasing me out into the night, and there she was. Liz sat slumped at the base of the temple, her hair matted with dirt, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes stared blankly into the distance, unseeing. I hoisted her onto my back, half carrying her as we stumbled toward the river. The jungle no longer seemed to resist us. It watched instead, silently observing, as if satisfied that we were leaving. The whispers faded, replaced by the distant hum of insects and the rustle of leaves in the wind. When we reached the riverbank, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. I collapsed onto the ground, clutching Liz to me as I gasped for breath. The jungle stood behind us, dark and impenetrable, as if daring us to return. We didn't. We followed the river, step by agonizing step, until civilization finally greeted us. But the jungle never truly let us go. In every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every dream, I felt it watching. It had marked us, and I knew we would never escape it completely. The jungle doesn't forgive. It only waits.